That gaze wasn't wild. It wasn't furious. It was small, afraid, trapped. And the moment those dark eyes locked onto mine through the falling snow, I realized I had only seconds to decide what kind of man I really was. My name is Ethan Walker. I'm 60 years old, and I've lived most of my life in the Bitterroot Valley of Montana. I'm a hunter, the old-fashioned kind, the kind who trusts tracks and fresh snow more than headlines on a screen. I believe in discipline, in survival, in the simple law of the wild. You either endure or you don't. I don't believe in sentiment out here. I don't believe the forest owes us mercy, and I certainly never believed I'd risk my life to save a predator. To me, the woods held only two things: hunters and the hunted. At least, that's what I used to think. Until one winter morning, when my retired German Shepherd canine stopped dead in the snow, and we found a young grizzly caught in a steel trap that wasn't mine. What happened next changed not only that bear's life, but mine, and the life of the only partner I had left. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from, and if stories about loyalty, redemption, and the wild speak to you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. Now, let me tell you what really happened in that frozen valley. Early December in Bitterroot Valley, Montana, never asked permission before it turned brutal. The first real storm of winter had rolled down from the north overnight, leaving the small town of Darby half buried in white. Roof lines sagged under fresh snow, smoke drifted thin and blue from chimneys, and the mountains that framed the valley stood silent and indifferent beneath a low iron sky. 10 miles outside town, where the paved road gave up and the forest took over, Ethan Walker lived alone in a weathered log cabin pressed against the edge of federal land. Ethan Walker was 60 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of solid build that came from decades of working outdoors, rather than lifting weights in a gym. His beard was mostly gray now, trimmed short but uneven, and his weathered face carried the faint map lines of sun, wind, and regret. A thin scar ran along his left jaw, courtesy of a barbed wire fence in his 20s. His eyes were a pale, steady blue, the kind that seemed calm even when he was not. He had once been both a hunter and a park ranger, an unusual combination that had shaped him into something balanced between enforcement and instinct. He knew how to track, how to shoot, how to survive. But he also knew the laws that protected what others tried to exploit. That duality had cost him friends in both camps. He preferred it that way. The only soul who shared the cabin full-time was Ranger. Ranger was a 9-year-old German Shepherd, large even for his breed, with a thick sable coat now threaded lightly with gray along his muzzle. His left ear stood straight and sharp. The right had a slight fold at the tip, from an old injury during a collapsed building search years ago. Ranger had once been a certified search and rescue canine, trained to detect human scent across miles of wilderness and disaster zones. His temperament was disciplined, observant, and deeply loyal. But lately, when he stood too long after sleeping, there was stiffness in his hips. Ethan noticed everything. That morning, Ethan adjusted the wool collar of his coat and stepped off the porch into knee-deep snow. The cold bit immediately at exposed skin. Ranger moved beside him without being called, head low, nose already working the air. They were not out for sport. Ethan had set 2 legal traps days earlier for coyotes that had been threatening local livestock. He believed in control, not cruelty. Each trap was marked, regulated, and checked regularly. As they moved deeper into the tree line, the world narrowed to white and gray. Pine branches sagged under heavy snow, occasionally releasing a soft cascade that fell like powdered glass. Their boots and paws left the only fresh impressions in an otherwise untouched field. Ranger stopped first, not abruptly, but with intention. His body stiffened, head angled slightly left. Instead of barking, he released a low, contained growl deep in his chest. Ethan froze. That sound meant uncertainty. Not aggression, not prey, something else. "What is it, boy?" Ethan murmured quietly. Ranger didn't look at him. His amber-brown eyes were locked on a slope 20 yards ahead. Ethan followed the line of sight. At first he saw nothing but snowdrift and wind patterns. Then he saw it, a small track. He stepped forward slowly, crouching near the indentation. It was round, wide, with shallow claw impressions at the front. Bare, small, cub. But that alone wasn't wrong. Black bears still moved occasionally in early winter before true hibernation set in. What was wrong was what followed. Several feet ahead, the snow was disturbed, not by wandering, but by dragging. A shallow trough carved through powder, and then a dark patch. Ethan reached down and brushed snow aside with his gloved hand. Frozen blood. His jaw tightened. Ranger stepped forward cautiously now, nostrils flaring. Ethan rose slowly, scanning the tree line. The forest remained still. No wind, no crows, no movement. Easy, he muttered. They followed the trail. The drag marks grew more pronounced. Snow churned in tight arcs. The cub had struggled. And then Ethan saw the metal. Half buried beneath snow and blood sat an old steel leg-hold trap, rust creeping along its jaws, teeth curved inward like a cruel grin. The chain extended to a buried anchor stake. Inside it, a bear cub. The animal was larger than a newborn but still young, perhaps 8 months old. Its thick black fur was matted with frozen blood around the front left leg. The trap had clamped just above the paw, compressing bone and flesh. The cub wasn't roaring. It wasn't even snarling. It was shaking. Its dark eyes were wide but dull with exhaustion. Steam rose faintly from its body into the freezing air. Ethan felt something tighten in his chest. Ranger moved slightly ahead of him, posture alert but not hostile. He did not bark. He simply stood between Ethan and the surrounding woods, protecting, watching. Ethan knelt slowly, careful not to make sudden moves. The cub gave a weak grunt and tried to pull back, but the chains snapped taut. The movement only reopened the wound slightly, and fresh blood welled before freezing again. Ethan studied the trap. It wasn't one of his. He never used this model. It was outdated and illegal on federal land. He leaned closer and brushed snow from the metal plate. There, scratched faintly into the rusted surface, was a marking he recognized. 3 diagonal lines. A symbol used by a small group of local poachers who had been pushing deeper into protected zones ever since the timber dispute escalated. Timber dispute. Ethan's gaze darkened. For months now, Silver Ridge Logging Company had been trying to secure access rights through a stretch of forest adjacent to his cabin. The proposed road would cut through wildlife corridors and push machinery dangerously close to protected habitats. Ethan had testified publicly against the proposal. He had made enemies. He looked at the cub again. This wasn't an accident. Ranger shifted his weight and glanced back at Ethan briefly, just enough to ask the question without sound. What now? Ethan removed his gloves slowly. The cold stabbed immediately at his fingers. He did not reach for his rifle. Instead, he exhaled long and steady. "Not mine," he whispered under his breath. The cub's breathing was shallow, fast. If the mother was nearby, she would smell blood. If she returned now, Ranger's ears twitched sharply. Ethan turned his head. Silence. But silence meant nothing. His mind flickered briefly to another face. Emily Walker. His daughter, 32 years old, lean, sharp-featured, with chestnut hair usually tied in a practical knot at the back of her head. Her eyes mirrored his own blue but held a fiercer fire. She was a wildlife biologist based in Colorado, specializing in predator rehabilitation. Unlike her father, she believed hunting had no place in modern conservation. Their last argument had ended with her standing in this very cabin doorway 3 years ago, telling him, "You can't protect something you're willing to kill." She hadn't come home since. He had told himself it didn't matter, but standing in the snow now, looking at the trembling cub, he felt the echo of that sentence. Ranger lowered his body slightly, protective but calm. Snow collected along his back. Ethan studied the mechanism. The trap could be opened manually, but it would require pressure and precision. If the cub panicked, it could break its own leg trying to pull free. He moved slowly, deliberately, lowering himself onto one knee in the snow. The cub's eyes fixed on him. Fear. Pain. No rage. Ethan swallowed. "I know," he muttered quietly. Behind him, the forest remained still, but it did not feel empty. This was only the beginning. He reached toward the cold steel jaws. Ethan's bare fingers hovered inches above the rusted steel jaws. The cold bit into his skin so sharply it felt like fire, but he barely noticed. What he noticed was the forest, the way it pressed inward, the way silence seemed layered, one silence for snow, one silence for trees, and another, heavier silence that belonged to something watching. The cub's breath came in short, shallow bursts. Each exhale fogged the air and vanished. Its trapped leg trembled violently, Not from aggression, but from exhaustion. The chain clinked faintly whenever it shifted. Behind Ethan, Ranger adjusted his stance. The old German shepherd moved half a step forward, placing himself between Ethan and the open woods. He did not bark. His ears stood tall, scanning left and right in minute rotations. His muscles were coiled but controlled. The slight stiffness in his hind legs was still there, but it did not slow his reaction time. Ethan understood the message without looking back. She could be close. A sow grizzly defending a cub would not warn. She would charge. Ethan swallowed and forced himself to breathe evenly. He had faced charging animals before, but this was different. This wasn't a hunt. There was no clean line between threat and target. The cub let out a weak, desperate sound as he shifted closer. Its dark eyes rolled toward him, wide with fear. When Ethan extended his hand slowly toward the trap's spring mechanism, the cub jerked instinctively, snapping its jaws weakly in reflex. Ranger reacted instantly. He lunged forward just enough to place himself at Ethan's shoulder, releasing a deep, commanding bark that echoed once across the snowfield. It wasn't a threat. It was a warning. The cub froze, startled by the sharpness of the sound. "Easy," Ethan murmured, his voice low and steady. He had once calmed panicked hikers in blizzards using that same tone. Easy now. He pulled off his heavy wool coat in one swift movement, ignoring the cold that immediately wrapped around him. Carefully, slowly, he moved closer and draped the coat over the cub's head, covering its eyes. Darkness could calm prey animals. It reduced stimuli, reduced panic. The cub thrashed once more, claws scraping against snow and steel. A front paw lashed outward blindly. Ranger shifted again, intercepting the movement. One claw grazed along his right foreleg, slicing through fur and drawing a thin line of red that contrasted sharply against his sable coat. Ranger did not retreat. He didn't even whine. He simply repositioned, planting himself more firmly between Ethan and the cub's blind strikes. Ethan saw the blood. His jaw tightened, but his hands did not stop moving. "Hold steady, boy," he whispered. The trap was old but powerful. Ethan positioned his hands on the spring arms, bracing himself. He leaned his weight downward, forcing the jaws apart. Rust resisted. Metal groaned faintly. For a second, nothing happened. Then the mechanism gave. With a sharp, metallic snap, the jaws released. The cub's injured legs slipped free. For one suspended moment, everything stilled. Then the cub collapsed sideways into the snow. It didn't run. It didn't attack. It simply fell, too weak to stand. The freed leg lay twisted awkwardly. The flesh was crushed but not severed. Blood seeped slowly through matted fur. Ethan released the trap and let it fall beside him. The coat still covered the cub's head, muting its world. He stayed kneeling. Ranger eased forward cautiously now, lowering his head slightly to sniff the air near the cub's flank. His tail did not wag. His body remained guarded. But there was something else in his posture, a recognition of vulnerability. Ethan's mind flickered briefly, unbidden, to the last conversation he'd had with Emily. It had been late spring, 3 years ago. She had stood in this same forest clearing, taller than he remembered, her posture straight and defiant. Emily Walker had always carried herself with a quiet intensity, slim but strong, with long legs built for hiking miles of backcountry. Her chestnut hair had escaped its tie that day, whipping in the wind as she argued. Her voice had not been loud, but it had cut deeper than shouting ever could. "You're a man who belongs to the past, Dad," she had said. "You protect what you understand, and you destroy what you don't." He had told himself she was wrong. Now, kneeling beside a trembling cub with his coat draped over its eyes, he felt the weight of her words pressing against his ribs. Ranger shifted his weight again, lifting his injured foreleg briefly before setting it back down. The cut was shallow, but it was there. Ethan noticed everything. He reached slowly toward the cub's injured limb. The animal flinched even through the coat, a low, pained growl vibrating through its chest. "I'm not your enemy," Ethan said quietly, unsure if he meant it for the cub or for himself. The forest answered with nothing. He examined the wound without fully removing the coat. The leg was swollen already. The paw twitched weakly. It would need cleaning, compression, possibly splinting. He glanced at the tree line again. Still nothing. But the longer they remained exposed, the greater the risk. Ranger suddenly stiffened. not aggressively, alert. His ears pivoted sharply toward the north ridge. Ethan followed the motion. At first, he saw only snow-laden branches. Then he noticed something subtle, a broken pine limb halfway up the slope, fresh, snow still sliding from the fracture point. Something had moved there recently. His pulse quickened. "Time's up," he muttered. The cub stirred faintly under the coat, trying weakly to pull itself upright. It managed only a partial lift before sagging again. Ethan hesitated. This was the moment where instinct and fear collided. He could leave now. The trap was open. Nature could decide the rest. But if the sow arrived to find her cub injured and a man's scent everywhere, or if the poachers returned to check their illegal line, he couldn't leave it like this. Ranger looked at him briefly, eyes steady. Trust. Ethan slid his arms carefully beneath the cub's torso. The animal was heavier than it looked, solid muscle beneath thick winter fur. It groaned weakly, but did not thrash. He lifted. The cub sagged against his chest, surprisingly warm despite the snow. Ranger moved immediately to Ethan's right side, scanning constantly, his injured leg ignored. Each step through the snow felt deliberate, heavy. Ethan kept his pace controlled but urgent. The broken limb on the ridge no longer moved, but that meant nothing. They reached the edge of the clearing where pine trunks offered partial cover. Ethan paused briefly to look back at the trap lying open in the snow. The 3 diagonal marks carved into its plate caught the light once more. The mark of men who had no intention of checking what they caught. He memorized the image. Then he turned away. Snow began falling again, thicker now, erasing footprints almost as quickly as they formed. Within minutes, the clearing looked nearly untouched, but Ethan knew better. As they disappeared into the deeper timber, Ranger limped once, but kept moving, head high, nose working the wind. The forest swallowed them. By the time Ethan reached the cabin clearing, the snow had thickened into a steady curtain, blurring distance and swallowing sound. The sky had darkened faster than expected, clouds pressing low over the Bitterroot peaks. His arms burned from the weight of the cub, and each step through deep powder felt like walking against an invisible current. Ranger stayed tight at his side, despite the thin line of blood drying along his foreleg, his breathing controlled but heavier than usual. The cabin emerged gradually from the white, logs dark against snow, chimney smoke trailing faintly. It had stood there for nearly 40 years, built by Ethan's father with hand-cut timber and stubborn pride. The place smelled permanently of pine sap, iron stove heat, and old leather. Ethan shouldered the door open and stepped inside, kicking it shut behind him with urgency. Warmth rushed over them. He lowered the cub carefully onto a thick wool blanket near the cast-iron stove. The animal's body felt limp but not lifeless. Its breathing was shallow but steady. Snow melted instantly from its fur, dampening the blanket beneath. Ranger circled once before settling close enough for his body heat to transfer, but not so close as to crowd. His amber eyes never left the cub's flank. He watched the rise and fall of its ribs with quiet vigilance. Ethan moved quickly now. He stripped off his frozen coat and boots, rolled up his flannel sleeves, and grabbed the first aid kit from a shelf near the sink. The kit was old but well stocked. Gauze, antiseptic, bandages, splints. A habit formed from decades in the wild where help could be days away. He knelt beside the cub and slowly peeled back fur around the crushed leg. The injury was worse in proper light. Deep bruising had already spread, and the flesh was torn where the steel had bitten down. Not a clean wound, more of a crushing trauma. The cub stirred faintly, but did not lash out. "That's right," Ethan murmured. "Save your strength." He rinsed the wound gently with warm water first, washing away clotted blood. The cub's muscles tensed under his hands. A low, exhausted groan vibrated from its throat, but it did not snap. Ranger shifted closer, his body a silent barrier, his head lowering slightly as if to reassure. When Ethan applied antiseptic, the cub jerked hard once, claws scraping against wood flooring. Ranger let out a single deep bark, not loud, but firm. The cub froze, startled again. "Easy," Ethan repeated, though his own hands trembled faintly. He worked carefully, cleaning debris from the wound and wrapping gauze tight but not constricting. He splinted the limb using a trimmed cedar strip from the woodpile, securing it with layered bandage wraps. His movements were deliberate, methodical, hands that had done this before, but never for something quite like this. The scent inside the cabin shifted, metallic blood mixing with pine smoke and antiseptic. But beneath it, there was something else. Life, raw and stubborn. When he finished, Ethan leaned back slightly, studying the cub. Its breathing had slowed. The panic in its eyes had softened into confusion. It blinked slowly. Then it looked at him. Not at Ranger, not at the door. At him. There was no snarl in its expression, no aggression, only fear, and something cautious. Ethan felt his throat tighten unexpectedly. Ranger lowered himself fully to the floor now, pressing his side gently against the cub's flank. The contact was deliberate, controlled. He was offering warmth. The cub did not resist. Outside, wind brushed along the cabin walls in soft gusts. Ethan rose stiffly and crossed to the counter, pulling his phone from his pocket. For a moment, he simply stared at it. His thumb hovered over a contact he hadn't called in 3 years. Emily. He almost put the phone down. Instead, he pressed call. It rang longer than he expected. Then, Dad? Her voice was sharper than he remembered. Controlled, guarded. Emily Walker had always sounded older than her years. She had inherited his height, 5'9", and his steady gaze, but her features were finer, her jaw softer. Years working in field biology had given her a lean strength. There was a steadiness in her that came from choosing a path alone and sticking to it. Their last argument had hardened her tone toward him, but beneath it was still the girl who once followed him into these woods at age 10, notebook in hand, documenting bird calls. "I need advice," Ethan said simply. Silence lingered for a breath. For what? A juvenile black bear. Male, maybe 8 months. Crushed foreleg from a steel trap. I cleaned it, splinted it, breathing steady but weak. Another silence, but this one different. Professional. "You did what?" she asked quietly. "I freed him. He's here." "Here where?" "In the cabin." Her exhale came through the line, controlled but sharp. "Dad, do you understand what that means?" "I understand he'd be dead if I'd left him." There was a shift in her breathing. "What's the capillary refill like?" she asked finally, slipping into clinical tone. Ethan glanced down, pressing gently against the cub's paw pad. Slow, but present. "Any exposed bone?" "No." "Swelling?" "Yes." "Keep him warm. Minimal movement. Change the wrap if bleeding increases. If he spikes fever, you'll see lethargy shift to agitation." He nodded instinctively, even though she couldn't see him. "And infection?" "High risk. You'll need antibiotics. You don't have wildlife-grade meds, do you?" "No." She hesitated again. "I'll email you dosage guidance based on weight estimates. It's not ideal, but it's something." Ethan swallowed. "Thank you." Another pause. "You can't keep him long," she said quietly. "His mother may still be searching." "I know." The line remained silent for several seconds before she spoke again, softer this time. "I didn't think you'd ever call me for something like this." "I didn't think I would either." The call ended without resolution, but not with hostility. Ethan set the phone down slowly. A soft thud sounded against the cabin door. He turned sharply. Another knock, firmer this time. Ranger's head lifted instantly, ears forward. Ethan stepped cautiously toward the window and pulled the curtain aside just enough to see. A white pickup truck idled near the tree line, snow collecting across its hood. The logo on the door was unmistakable, Silver Ridge Logging. The driver stepped out. Marcus Hale was in his early 40s, broad through the shoulders, with a shaved head and a beard trimmed too precisely to be accidental. He wore a heavy brown work jacket and moved with the confidence of a man who believed the land would eventually belong to him. His eyes were small and calculating, always scanning, always measuring advantage. Years of corporate negotiations had polished his tone into something smooth but sharp-edged. Ethan opened the door just enough to step outside, closing it behind him. Marcus held a white envelope. "Evening, Ethan," Marcus said, his breath fogging in the cold. "Figured I'd deliver this personally." Ethan said nothing. Marcus handed over the envelope. 30-day notice. Final phase approval passed this morning. Survey teams will be marking boundaries soon. Ethan stared at the document without opening it. "You're cutting through migration corridors," he said evenly. "We're following permits. You're following money." Marcus smiled thinly. "Adaptation's part of survival, Ethan. You know that. Ranger appeared behind the window, visible through the glass, his silhouette unmistakable. Marcus glanced past Ethan. Still keeping that dog around? He's earned it. Marcus shrugged. 30 days. He turned back toward his truck, boots crunching over snow. Ethan stood in the cold long after the engine noise faded. When he stepped back inside, the cabin felt smaller. The cub had shifted slightly, but remained lying down. Its eyes opened briefly as he approached. It did not growl. It watched him. Ranger lay still beside it, protective but calm. Ethan folded the envelope slowly and placed it on the table. Snow continued to fall outside. Inside the cabin, the stove crackled softly, and for the first time in years, Ethan felt something unfamiliar filling the quiet space. Not conflict, not regret, but responsibility. The third night came with a deeper cold than the first two, the kind that made wood contract and floorboards whisper. Snow had stopped falling, leaving the world outside the cabin bright under a thin wash of moonlight. The sky was clear for the first time in days, stars sharp as shattered glass above the Bitterroot peaks. Inside, the stove had burned low, casting slow, orange pulses across the walls. Ethan had dozed in a chair near the hearth, boots still on, rifle leaning untouched in the corner. He had not allowed himself real sleep since bringing the cub inside. Ranger lay stretched along the floor beside the animal, their bodies almost touching. The cub's breathing was steadier now, though each inhale still carried a faint rasp. Then Ranger stood, not groggy, not gradual. He rose in one fluid motion, head snapping toward the door, ears fully erect. A low, restrained growl rolled from deep in his chest, not loud, not frantic, controlled, certain. Ethan's eyes opened instantly. "What is it?" he whispered, though he already knew. Ranger did not look at him. His gaze was fixed on the dark rectangle of the front door. Outside, something moved. It wasn't loud, not crashing, not charging, just presence, a shift in weight on snow, a breath. Ethan felt it before he heard it, the change in the air, the tension pressing against the cabin walls. He rose slowly, careful not to startle the cub. The animal stirred faintly, but did not panic. Ranger stepped forward, placing himself between Ethan and the door, stance solid despite the stiffness in his hips. His injured foreleg had scabbed over, but he favored it slightly now that adrenaline sharpened his senses. Then it came, a sound that did not belong to wind, a low, rolling huff, not a roar, a warning. Ethan's heart thudded once, hard. "She's here," he murmured. He crossed the room and turned off the single overhead light, plunging the cabin into dim stove glow. Shadows stretched longer. He did not reach for his rifle. Instead, he took a breath and moved toward the door. Ranger's growl deepened but did not escalate. Ethan placed his hand on the latch and paused. For a fraction of a second, instinct screamed to arm himself, to prepare for violence. Instead, he opened the door. Cold air rushed in, sharp and immediate. Moonlight spilled across the threshold. And there she stood. The sow was massive, larger than any black bear Ethan had seen in recent years. Her coat was thick and dark, almost absorbing the light, frost clinging along her shoulders. She stood perhaps 20 feet from the porch, head low but steady, not crouched, not charging, watching. Her eyes reflected pale silver in the moonlight, unblinking. Ethan stepped back slowly, lowering his arms to his sides to make himself smaller. He did not speak. Behind him, the cub shifted inside the cabin. A faint whine escaped it, small, instinctive. The sow's head lifted slightly. Ranger remained inside, but did not bark. His body was rigid, muscles tight beneath fur, yet he held position. He understood something Ethan did not need to say. Escalation would end badly. For several long seconds, no one moved. Then the cub made another sound, weak but unmistakable. Ethan glanced back. The cub was attempting to stand. Its injured leg trembled under weight, but it pushed itself upright in clumsy determination. It limped forward, dragging the splinted limb awkwardly across wooden boards. "Easy," Ethan whispered, though he did not touch it. The cub reached the threshold and paused, nose lifting into the cold air. The sow inhaled sharply. Recognition traveled through scent before sight. The cub stepped forward onto the porch, each movement uneven. Ranger shifted slightly but did not block it. Ethan stepped farther back into the cabin, leaving space. The cub descended the single wooden step, nearly stumbling before catching itself. The sow did not rush. She lowered her head slowly and exhaled again, a deep breath that fogged in white clouds. The cub answered with a small chuffing sound, softer than any growl, almost questioning. They met halfway between cabin and tree line. For a moment, the sow nudged the cub's neck gently, sniffing along its flank, pausing at the wrapped limb. Her massive head hovered over the bandage. She did not tear it away. She did not strike. She simply breathed. The cub leaned into her. Ethan realized he had been holding his own breath. The sow lifted her gaze briefly toward the cabin, toward him. Not hostility, not gratitude, assessment. Ranger's growl faded entirely. The forest held its silence as if listening. After a final nudge against her cub's shoulder, the sow turned slightly toward the trees. The cub hesitated, glancing back once toward the porch, where warmth still glowed faintly through the open doorway. Then it followed. Their dark shapes moved slowly across the snow, leaving deep impressions in the moonlit field. Within seconds, the trees swallowed them whole. Ethan closed the door gently. Inside, the stove crackled again. Ranger relaxed only slightly, though his ears remained alert. Ethan exhaled long and slow. He had no illusions that the forest had forgiven him, only that it had allowed him. Elsewhere, beyond the tree line and several miles east, 2 pickup trucks idled near the clearing where the trap had once been set. The men who stepped out wore heavy canvas jackets and carried flashlights that cut sharp beams through the dark. One of them, Clay Mercer, was tall and narrow-faced, with a hooked nose and restless eyes. He had grown up running illegal trap lines taught by an uncle who believed wildlife existed to be claimed. Clay's temper was short, sharpened by too many winters, scraping by on small profits. Beside him stood Doyle Briggs, heavier set, with a thick beard and slower speech. Doyle followed more than he led. He liked money, but avoided direct confrontation whenever possible. Clay crouched near the disturbed snow. "The trap's gone," he muttered. Doyle shone his light over churned ground. "Chain's still here." Clay's jaw tightened. Someone opened it. Maybe it snapped loose. Clay shook his head. Not like that. He stood slowly, scanning the surrounding forest. His eyes narrowed toward the direction of Ethan's property line. "That old ranger's been sticking his nose where it don't belong." Doyle shifted uncomfortably. "You think he'd mess with us?" Clay spat into the snow. "He testified against Silver Ridge. Thinks he owns this valley." His gaze hardened. "We'll pay him a visit." Back in Colorado, Emily Walker sat at her small kitchen table under a single pendant light, laptop open before her. She had not been able to sleep since the call. At 32, her life was ordered. Fieldwork schedules, grant proposals, research notes stacked in clean lines. But her father's voice that night had carried something unfamiliar, not defiance, concern. Emily's hands were slender but calloused from years handling wildlife. A faint scar ran across her knuckles from a rescue gone wrong during graduate school, a reminder that compassion could wound. She stared at a map of western Montana on her screen. Then she opened an airline booking page, her jaw set. She did not call him to announce it. She simply purchased the ticket. Back at the cabin, Ethan sat by the dying fire long after Ranger had settled again. Snowlight still filtered faintly through the window, illuminating the empty floor where the cub had lain. He replayed the sow's eyes in his mind. Not rage, not trust, something older. Ranger lifted his head once, as if sensing Ethan's thoughts, then lowered it again. Outside, far in the distance, a single low call echoed faintly across the valley. Not a roar, a presence, and then it faded. The morning after the sow and cub disappeared into the timber, the valley looked deceptively peaceful. Sunlight struck the snowfields in clean white brilliance. The sky washed pale blue after the night's cold clarity. The world felt reset, as if nothing unusual had passed through it. But Ranger knew better. He stood on the porch before Ethan even poured his coffee, nose lifted, ears pivoting toward the lower ridge that bordered the cabin clearing. The old German shepherd's body was rigid, though the slight tremor in his hips betrayed the strain of too many hard winters. The cut on his foreleg had healed enough to scab over, but the deeper ache in his joints flared in the cold. He gave a short, sharp bark, not alarm, alert. Ethan stepped outside immediately, scanning the tree line. He saw them seconds later, two figures moving deliberately between the pines, boots crushing fresh snow. Clay Mercer emerged first from the timber, shoulders squared, jaw tight beneath his hooked nose. The light caught the irritation already simmering in his restless eyes. Behind him walked Doyle Briggs, heavier and slower, but carrying a length of metal chain coiled around one hand. They didn't hide their approach. They wanted to be seen. Ethan stepped fully onto the porch, closing the cabin door behind him. Ranger positioned himself just ahead of Ethan's knee, not aggressive but unmistakably ready. Clay stopped about 20 yards away. "You've been busy," he called out, voice flat but edged. Ethan didn't answer immediately. Doyle shifted his weight, glancing toward the surrounding trees as if expecting witnesses. "You opened something that wasn't yours?" Clay pressed. Ethan's gaze didn't waver. "I removed something illegal from federal land." Clay's lip twitched. "Illegal's a flexible word around here." Ranger growled low, deep in his chest. Clay's eyes flicked to the dog. "Still keeping that relic around?" Ethan rested a calm hand lightly against Ranger's shoulder, not to restrain him, but to steady him. "You're trespassing." Clay took a slow step forward. "You think that matters?" Ethan could feel the tension building in the space between them, thick and brittle as ice before cracking. He also knew exactly how this would end if he reached for the rifle leaning just inside the door. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket. Clay's posture shifted instantly, muscles tightening as if expecting a weapon. Ethan pulled out a small remote device and pressed a button. From the trees beyond the clearing, a faint mechanical click sounded. Doyle's head snapped toward the ridge. "What's that?" he muttered. Ethan gestured calmly toward a pine trunk 50 yards behind them. Mounted high against the bark, nearly invisible against shadow and snow, was a compact trail camera, one of several he had installed months ago when Silver Ridge's surveyors began creeping closer to his property line. "I don't set traps without checking my perimeter," Ethan said evenly. Clay's expression flickered for a fraction of a second. Ethan continued, voice measured. "That camera recorded you placing the trap 3 nights ago. Date stamped. GPS tagged." Doyle's jaw dropped slightly. "You're bluffing." Ethan shook his head once. "No." Clay's nostrils flared. Ranger stepped half a pace forward, body aligned between Ethan and the two men. The dog's weight shifted onto his front legs, his aging joints forgotten in the presence of threat. Clay glanced around the clearing again, calculating. "You think anyone cares?" he sneered. "You're getting pushed out in 30 days anyway." Ethan held up his phone and tapped the screen deliberately. "I already sent the footage to the County Wildlife Enforcement Unit," he said, "along with coordinates." The words hung in the air. Doyle's shoulders sagged slightly. But Clay cut him off with a sharp gesture. "You always did think you were better than us," Clay said, voice lower now. "Ranger badge still hanging in your head?" Ethan's eyes didn't harden. They steadied. "This land isn't yours to carve up." For a split second, Clay's gaze shifted toward the cabin window, toward the warmth inside, toward the possibility of fear. He saw none. Instead, Ranger stepped fully into view, broad chest forward, eyes locked unflinchingly on the men. Despite the stiffness in his hips, he looked every inch the working canine he once was, disciplined, unwavering. The low rumble in his chest deepened. Clay's bravado thinned. In the distance, the faint sound of an approaching engine began to rise. Doyle heard it first. "Clay," he muttered again, tension slipping into his voice. Clay's jaw clenched hard enough to show muscle in his cheek. "You made a mistake," he said to Ethan, but the certainty was gone. Ethan didn't respond. Within minutes, a green and white County Wildlife Enforcement truck emerged along the dirt access road, tires crunching over frozen ruts. The vehicle stopped near the edge of the clearing. Officer Daniel Ruiz stepped out first. Ruiz was in his late 30s, compact and athletic, with dark hair cropped short and a steady gaze that missed little. He had transferred from Arizona Fish and Game years ago, bringing with him a reputation for quiet persistence. He wasn't loud, wasn't flashy, but he was thorough. Behind him stepped Deputy Karen Holt, taller and broader shouldered, with auburn hair pulled into a tight braid. Her expression rarely softened, a result of too many seasons dealing with armed disputes in remote backcountry. Ruiz took in the scene quickly. "Morning, Ethan." Ethan nodded once. Morning. Ruiz's eyes shifted to Clay and Doyle. Gentlemen. Clay's posture adjusted instantly, less confrontational now, more defensive. We were just checking on our equipment, Clay said. Equipment on federal land without permit? Holt asked dryly. Ruiz walked toward the pine where the camera was mounted. He studied the device, then looked back at Ethan. Footage clear? Clear enough. Ruiz nodded once and returned to the group. We'll need you both to come with us. Clay's eyes flared again. This is harassment. No, Holt replied calmly. It's documentation. As Ruiz moved to place temporary restraints, Clay shot one final glare at Ethan. This isn't over. Ethan met his gaze without anger. It never was. Ranger held his ground until the two men were escorted toward the truck. Only then did the dog's posture ease slightly. A second vehicle pulled into the clearing moments later. A silver rental SUV dusted in road salt. The engine cut and the driver's door opened. Emily stepped out. She wore a dark field jacket over hiking boots, her hair pulled back tightly against the Montana wind. The flight had left faint shadows beneath her eyes, but her posture was firm. There was resolve in her stance now, less accusation, more clarity. She took in the scene quickly. The officers, the departing poachers, her father standing upright without a weapon in his hands. Her gaze shifted to Ranger first. The dog's ears perked at her scent, recognition flickering in his eyes. Emily approached slowly. You didn't shoot, she said quietly, stopping a few feet from Ethan. No. You could have. Yes. She studied his face for a long moment, searching for the version of him she once argued against. Instead, she saw something steadier. Ranger limped forward gently and pressed his head against her thigh in greeting. Emily knelt instinctively, fingers moving through his thick fur, checking the healing cut on his foreleg with trained efficiency. You've been working too hard, she murmured to him softly. Ethan watched the interaction without speaking. Ruiz approached briefly, paperwork in hand. Charges will move forward. We've had complaints about illegal trap lines for months. Ethan nodded. Appreciated. Ruiz glanced at Emily. Good timing. She offered a small nod in return. When the enforcement truck finally pulled away with Clay and Doyle in the back, the clearing returned to quiet. Snow reflected bright under midday sun. Emily rose slowly to stand beside her father. You handled it differently, she said. Ethan looked toward the forest where the sow and cub had vanished the night before. I'm learning, he replied. Ranger stood between them, steady despite the ache in his joints, and for the first time in years, the space between father and daughter felt less like distance and more like ground being reclaimed. Winter did not leave Bitterroot Valley all at once. It loosened its grip slowly, reluctantly, as if unwilling to surrender what it had claimed. Snowbanks shrank into gray-edged ridges along the tree line. Meltwater traced silver veins through the thawing earth. The river that had slept beneath ice began to murmur again, low and steady, carrying fragments of broken frost downstream. By late April, green pushed through the forest floor in careful patches. Pine needles shimmered brighter. The air no longer bit, it breathed. Ethan stood at the edge of his clearing one morning with Ranger beside him, watching mist lift from the valley floor. He wore no heavy coat now, only a worn flannel and canvas vest. The deep lines in his face seemed softer in spring light, less carved by winter's severity. Ranger, though slower now, held his head high. The stiffness in his hips remained, but warmth had eased the ache. His muzzle was nearly silver, but his eyes still carried that steady amber focus that had guided him through disaster sites and blizzards years ago. They began walking along the forest edge, not hunting, not tracking, just walking. It had become a habit. The cabin behind them had changed over the past 2 months. What once functioned solely as a hunter's refuge had gradually shifted into something else. Shelves that once stored ammunition now held medical supplies, saline solution, gauze, splints, antiseptics, and wildlife reference manuals. Ethan had reinforced one side of the porch into a small covered enclosure where injured animals could be stabilized temporarily before transfer to licensed rehabilitation centers. He hadn't advertised it loudly. Word simply spread. The first had been a red fox caught in barbed wire, then a hawk with a fractured wing. Each time, Ethan worked quietly, methodically. Ranger stayed close, watching every patient with calm vigilance. Emily had noticed the shift long before Ethan acknowledged it aloud. She had returned to Montana 2 weeks after the confrontation with Clay Mercer, not for a visit, but with a decision. Her apartment in Colorado was subleased. Her research position had been transferred through a colleague's recommendation. Now she worked at the Bitterroot Wildlife Conservation Center, a modest but respected facility 20 miles south of the cabin. The center's director, Dr. Sarah Whitman, was a woman in her early 50s, with steel-gray hair cut short at the jawline and sharp hazel eyes that missed little. Sarah carried herself with efficient confidence, shaped by decades in wildlife medicine. A past accident during a remote rescue mission had left her with a faint limp in her right leg, but it never slowed her resolve. She had met Ethan cautiously at first. "You're the ranger who testified against Silver Ridge," she had said during their initial meeting, studying him carefully. "I was," he replied. Sarah had nodded once. "Good." The environmental review that followed Clay Mercer's arrest had uncovered more than illegal traps. Survey data showed potential damage to critical wildlife corridors. Silver Ridge Logging withdrew its expansion proposal quietly 3 weeks later, citing unforeseen regulatory delays. In town, people whispered about lawsuits and fines. Ethan never commented publicly. Now, as he and Ranger walked along the tree line, sunlight filtered through newly budding branches. The earth smelled rich and damp. Ranger paused suddenly, not stiff, not tense, curious. Ethan followed his gaze. Across a shallow meadow where snow had fully melted, movement stirred near the edge of the pines. 2 shapes, dark against green. Ethan stopped. Ranger did not bark. He did not growl. He simply sat beside Ethan, posture straight, tail resting lightly against the grass. The sow stepped into clearer view first. Her coat had shed much of its winter thickness, revealing strong muscle beneath. She moved without urgency, head lifting briefly to scan the open space. Behind her emerged the cub, larger now, stronger. Its gait was steady, though a faint irregularity lingered in the once crushed leg. The splint had long been removed, but the healing process had left a subtle reminder. The cub stepped forward into the meadow sunlight and paused. Its nose lifted into the air. Distance separated them, at least 200 yards, but scent traveled. Ethan did not move. Ranger remained seated. The cub turned its head slightly toward the clearing, toward Ethan. For a single suspended moment, its dark eyes locked onto his. There was no fear in them now, no confusion, just awareness. Time seemed to thin. Wind brushed softly through grass, carrying the scent of pine and thawed earth. Ethan felt something loosen inside his chest, something that had been wound tight all winter. The cub took one small step forward. The sow shifted immediately, nudging it gently at the shoulder. Not aggressive, protective. The cub held Ethan's gaze 1 second longer, then it turned. Mother and cub moved together toward the deeper forest, their shapes gradually blending into shadow and green. Ranger's ears remained forward until they disappeared completely. Only then did he exhale softly and lower his head. Ethan rested a hand on the dog's back. "You did good," he murmured quietly. Ranger's tail thumped once against the grass. Behind them, a truck engine sounded faintly from the dirt road. Emily stepped out moments later, hiking boots crunching lightly over gravel. She had grown leaner in the months since returning, sun-browned from field work. There was steadiness in her posture now, less edge, more clarity. "You saw them?" she asked gently. Ethan nodded. She followed his gaze toward the trees. "They look strong," she said. "They are." Emily stepped closer to Ranger, kneeling briefly to scratch behind his folded ear. "County Council approved his honorary recognition," she said, glancing up at Ethan. "They're presenting it next week." Ethan's brow furrowed slightly. "Recognition?" "Honorary K-9 Service Medal for community protection." Ranger lifted his head at the tone of her voice, though he didn't understand the words. Ethan allowed a small smile to touch his mouth. "He doesn't need medals." "Maybe not," Emily replied softly, "but sometimes people do." The 3 of them stood quietly at the forest's edge. No rifles, no traps, no tension. The valley breathed. Emily looked toward the cabin behind them, the modified porch enclosure, the stacked crates of medical supplies. the simple wooden sign she had carved and mounted beside the door 2 weeks earlier. Bitterroot Wildlife Aid, temporary rescue and stabilization. You never thought you'd run a rescue station, she said. Ethan shook his head once. Didn't think I'd need to. She studied him for a moment. I was wrong about one thing, she said quietly. He glanced at her. You don't belong to the past. The words hung gently between them. Ranger shifted slightly, leaning against Ethan's leg. In the distance, a hawk circled above the tree line. The forest was not conquered. It was shared. And as spring sunlight warmed the clearing where snow once buried everything, Ethan understood something simple and steady. He had not saved the wild. He had only chosen not to stand against it. And sometimes, that was enough. At the end of this story, the lesson is not really about a bear or a trap, or even a man who once called himself a hunter. It is about choice. Every day, in ways big and small, we stand at the edge of our own clearing. We meet moments where we can act out of fear, pride, anger, or habit. Or we can choose something quieter, something braver. Ethan could have walked away. He could have reached for his rifle. He could have said it was not his responsibility. Instead, he chose to help. And that choice did not just save a cub. It restored a relationship. It protected a valley. It changed a heart that thought it was already set in stone. In our daily lives, we may not face wild animals in the snow, but we face wounded moments, broken relationships, opportunities to step in when it would be easier to stay silent. Sometimes protecting what is right does not require force. Sometimes it requires restraint, patience, humility. Sometimes the strongest thing we can do is lower the weapon in our hands, whatever that weapon may be, and extend it as an open palm instead. Maybe there is someone in your life who needs that kind of mercy right now. Maybe there is a situation where you can choose compassion over control. If this story spoke to you, share it with someone who needs a reminder that strength and kindness can live in the same heart. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from and what moment in this story touched you the most. Your words might encourage someone else more than you realize. If you believe that we are called to protect life, to stand for what is right without hatred, and to act with courage when no one is watching, type Amen in the comments. And if you want more stories about faith, redemption, loyalty, and the quiet power of doing the right thing, make sure you subscribe to the channel and stay with us. May God bless you and your family. May He guide your steps when the path feels uncertain. May He give you courage when fear stands in front of you. And may He soften your heart in moments when it would be easier to harden it. Amen.